James Summers arrived in Cloughjordan, County Tipperary, on Saturday evening, the 28th of August 1950. Summers had just been given leave from the Army, where he was serving as a private in the 1st Enniskillen Fusiliers. At the Cloughjordan railway station, he was greeted by the Lord Lieutenant for Tipperary, Lord Dennehy, Captain Lefroy, the local recruiting officer, the Irish National Volunteer Brass Band, a number of military officers, and other members of the local gentry. Now, this reception was not afforded to every soldier who came back to Tipperary on leave, but James Summers had just won the Victoria Cross in Guildford. In a letter to his father, he described how he won the VC. He said, "I beat Turks out of our trench single-handed and had 4 awful hours at night. It is certain sure we are beating the Turks. In the trench I came out of, it was shocking to see the dead. There lay about 3,000 Turks in front of our trench, and the smell was absolutely chronic. You know when the sun has been shining on those bodies for 3 or 4 days, it makes a horrible smell. A person would not mind if it was impossible to bury them, but no, you dare not put your nose inside the trench, for if you did, you'd be a dead man." A meeting to honour Summers in Cloughjordan served as a potent propaganda. The Royal Irish Regiment band played beforehand, and on the platform included the Commander of the Forces in Ireland, Major General Ludwig Friend, the Police County Inspector, the Editor of the Nina Guardian, Lord Dennehy, Deputy Lieutenants, Colonels, Reverends, Church Curates and local officials. Summers got a cheque and war loan stock worth 240 sterling. Speeches were made lauding the VC winner. Through his action he had won glory for the county and justified hope that a new Ireland would evolve from the war. The same speeches, however, also called for more recruits to follow in Summers' footsteps. This spectacle marked the high point of the recruiting campaign in Tipperary in late 1950. However, it glossed over numerous divisions in the county, such as the recruiters' belief, or the recruiting sergeant's belief, that many more men could be spared, resentment locally over methods and speeches used, and further tension over perceived snugs to deeds of valour by Irish soldiers. Campaigns of recruitment were poorly organised, highly insensitive, and doomed to polarise local community. So, how did it come to this? So in this talk I want to focus just on a few themes from 1915. Firstly, I want to talk about how recruiting sergeants focused on negative appeals and trying to get people in list, threats. Then I want to talk for a little bit about who the recruiters were, who these people were going about the county appealing for recruits, and then finally I want to talk a little bit about motivations, why someone joined the army. There was no compulsory service in Tipperary, so anyone who did was a volunteer, and I want to ask just why someone would have enlisted. So to kind of set the scene, on the 20th of September 1914, the previous year, John Redmond, the leader of the Irish Parliamentary Party, told the Irish volunteers to fight wherever the firing line extends, effectively encouraging Irish volunteers to enlist in the British Army. Now, Redmond's colleagues in the Irish Party in Tipperary tacitly backed this and made the recruiting pitch at various meetings across the county. They insisted that while John Redmond had simply said anyone who wanted to join was welcome, the volunteers as a unit would not be conscripted. But local MPs such as John Cullen in the south and Tom Condon in the east emphasised the moral importance of the war. The brutality and inhumanity of the German war machine was condemned. The fate of poor Catholic Belgium was constantly evoked, and they praised the military tradition of Tipperary families. So despite saying it was okay to stay at home, they undoubtedly encouraged recruitment. To illustrate this, in March of 1915, Tom Condon, the MP, like I said, and who was also mayor of Clonmel at the time, visited Cashel. 500 of the Irish National Volunteers turned out, and he met with a number of wounded local soldiers who were back from the front. Condon congratulated these soldiers on what they had done for their county. He also said that he was proud of the doings of the Cashel soldiers at the front, and he was glad to see they were upholding their county's traditions for courage. So these are not really the words of someone opposed to the recruiting campaign. This was sort of like an off-the-cuff meeting where he just met with soldiers, but organised recruiting meetings were not held until the spring of 1915. So what was a typical recruiting meeting like? On the 26th of April 1915, the first meeting opened in Clonmel. was the first one in the county, the first organised meeting. Posters urging men to join the army covered the boardings and the walls of the town for a few days prior. The band of the Royal Irish Regiment, whose depot was based in Clonmel, marched through the town. They played national airs and then went on to the barracks and were met by the commanding officer there. Here, a number of men offered themselves for recruits, and during the evening, men enlisted in twos and threes. That evening, at about 8 o'clock, the band played through the town again, and the media reported that crowds followed the band and joined in with the songs. 20 joined on the first day of the campaign, and about 120 over the whole week. There were also economic incentives. For example, a £2 prize went to Richard Anderson, who was a worker in a brewery in Clonmel, for securing the most recruits, 15. So if you brought in your friends, you got paid money. So some firms also offered incentives to enlist. The same brewery, Murphy's, offered to keep a job open for any man who enlisted. And they also said they would pay 7 shillings to a man with dependents for every week he was away. The Nina Guardian and the North Tipperary County Council also offered to keep jobs open for anyone who enlisted. These campaigns were then usually followed by set-piece meetings. Now, at these meetings, there was a number of speakers, and there were many ways recruiters tried to encourage enlistment. Initially, the first few months of the war, recruiters used general themes to encourage recruiting. These themes were the threat of Prussian militarism, the threat of German invasion of Ireland, the martial spirit of Irish and Tipperary soldiers, military tradition, the rape of poor Catholic Belgium, and how the European war was now an Irish war because we got no rule. So these were general themes, but what I want to do tonight is just focus on 2 of the more controversial appeals or threats, if you want to look at it that way. Essentially, these were negative recruiting appeals, and they worked on fear. These were the use of atrocity reports, and secondly, more importantly, the threat of conscription. So firstly, the reports of German atrocities. If you look through the newspapers of the time, like the Nina Guardian, the Chronicle, the Nationalist, the Tipperary Star, any of these papers, you will see the columns about the war are littered with examples of supposed German atrocities in Belgium. These stories are rather lurid, and they detail sort of impaled babies, decapitated toddlers, mutilated members of religious orders. Henry McLaughlin was a man from Belfast who was in charge of recruiting in Ireland at this time. He visited Clonmel for another recruiting meeting and told a number of graphic atrocity stories at a set-piece meeting in the town. It's a very long piece, so I'll just take a small example of some of the stuff he was saying. He said, this is a quote, "A German regiment entered a small village. And as they came along the street, the villagers heard the jeers and laughter of soldiers, and they came out to see what was happening. What did they find? They found all this merriment and all this sport was caused by a 3-month-old baby kicking its life's blood out on the point of a German bayonet. At another meeting in Nina, people were told the Germans were inhuman, dirty. They killed children and innocent, inoffensive men. At Monaco, a female speaker told another crowd of the, quote, awful crimes against women and girls, which had disgraced the advance of the savage Huns. She asked, were the chaste and lovely womanhood of Ireland to fall by the same foe for want of men to defend them? At Borrisacane, another crowd was told, priests were fired upon, women insulted, and the sanctity of churches violated. This should be an incentive to Irishmen to don the khaki and have revenge for the wrongs inflicted on Belgium. For what occurred in Belgium would occur in Ireland if the Germans ever came here. So that's a small example of some of the stuff that they said about the German advance in Belgium, the German invasion of Belgium. Now, I suppose the question here is, how effective were these appeals in terms of stimulating recruiting? It's difficult to say, really. Certainly, the reception afforded to Belgian refugees who came to Tipperary in 1915 was genuine. It was a genuine humanitarian concern. People raised money, people offered their houses, and there was definitely an awareness of what was going on and a desire to help refugees. So these reports were carried from Belgium. But as 1915 wore on, these atrocity sort of reports began to be replaced by the most important theme during 1915. And that was basically the threat of conscription, which is tied in with massive criticism of farmers' sons, as the authorities felt not enough men were coming forward from this class, which was the middle class. So the fear of conscription existed in Tipperary from the very start of the war. And as it went on, many recruiting speakers began to threaten the audience, or threaten the people they were speaking to, with conscription if more men did not enlist. Irish parliamentary politicians in the county were forced to deny the imminent coming of compulsory military service when recruiting officials made frequent threats to what they perceived as a recalcitrant population. England at this time, around late 1915, was also moving away from the voluntary system to compulsion. And this only intensified the concerns of many Tipperarians. In July 1915, at another recruiting meeting in Clonmel, the town's sub-sheriff, John Dennehy, said he only came to this recruiting meeting to say that farmer sons should be enlisting. He said Clare, Carrick and parts of Clonmel had done well, had contributed to more effort, but was unreservedly critical about those whom he saw as slackers or shirkers. He said there were two classes who would not go to the front: the sons of farmers and the boys behind the counters, most of whom were the sons of farmers. In the town of Clonmel, they had big, able farmers' sons measuring out yards of ribbon when they should be pouring bullets out of machine guns. He also claimed a decent girl should be ashamed to recognise such men on the street. The mammy's son that stopped at home should be looked upon with contempt. Another speaker, Lieutenant Piggott of the Royal Irish Regiment, claimed many men were hanging back until conscription came. Did such fellows expect they will be treated like voluntary soldiers? He asked. He claimed conscripts would not get the separation allowance, would be treated as slackers and objects of ridicule, and girls would point the finger of scorn at them as people who let other men go and defend their room. So the threat and shame of conscription was a central theme of the recruiting campaign, i.e., go now or else risk being humiliated by force. Women looked with contempt upon slackers, men in Tipperary were told. Those two speakers, like Coderfirm, criticised farmer sons and shop assistants for their apparent willingness to enlist. They mocked them as cowards. They used gender in encouraging enlistment, and as a clear attempt to emasculate men who did not enlist, i.e., real men joined, whereas men fit for cutting ribbon stayed at home. Women in Tipperary were told to have no respect for these shirkers who left the fighting to others. A female's duty was to send her man to enlist, as the soldier at the front was a man's man, obviously more desirable, more worthy of respect, adulation, while the slacker who stayed at home was pathetic. That was the central message that was being given out. As the year wore on, recruiting appeals again mainly focused on this threat of conscription. In late 1915, Sergeant Booth told a recruiting meeting in Dundrum men would simply have to be fetched. He said, "I see around me fine, strapping, broad-shouldered young men. If these men did not come voluntarily, within the next 3 weeks, they would have to be fetched." Right here in Thurles, the chairman of the Urban Council appealed for more men to come forward and not wait for compulsion. This was the last attempt at voluntary recruiting, the crowd heard. A military speaker, Private Bernard Dempsey of the Irish Guards, urged men to enlist that day and not wait for conscription. This is the same meeting in Dundrum. For Dempsey and these other speakers, conscription was a certainty. And he also showed a distaste on behalf of the military for these voluntary recruiting meetings. He said, "There are thousands of Irishmen fighting out there. Join now and don't wait for conscription. I wouldn't like to be a conscript. Don't wait to be sent away like a wagon of cattle. These recruiting meetings are awful." So, from the very beginning of the campaign, the authorities felt farmer sons and shop assistants, commercial class, the middle class, were refusing to enlist. Police reported that farmers allegedly had received more state benefits than any other class, and shop assistants are still unwilling to do their share in the trenches. police, the Royal Irish Constabulary, if you look at their month-by-month reports throughout 1915, they continually deplore what they believe was a poor response by farmers. And the police said farmers displayed considerable anxiety on the question of conscription. In mid-1915, the police said while there had been no reports of farmers' sons emigrating through fear of conscription, there was no doubt they are not attending markets and fair days as they had been before. Their older relations going to the town to transact business, leaving the young men at home. Police claimed farmers were having a very prosperous time due to high prices, and the townspeople, urban people, were commenting on their lack of patriotism. So recruiters told farmers they were shirking their responsibilities and not fighting for their land. Farmers were also told if Germany won the war, it would take their land by force and throw out the whole system of land purchase. They were also told that Tipperary farms were mapped out in Berlin, and that it was unfair to let the labouring class bear the brunt of the fighting. Captain Lefroy, the local recruiting sergeant in Nina, told a meeting in the Glen of Arlo, "I'm ashamed of asking any more labouring men to join. We can't spare them, but we can spare plenty of farmers' sons. Are you going to let future history say that you, the farmers, refuse to fight and let others fight for you?" In Nina, Lord Dennehy, who was a prominent member of the gentry, launched a blistering attack on farmers. He went much further than most people and said, the people of Nina have done very well, but the farmers have not done very well. They are quite content to sit on their farm and live upon the fat of the land. Sorry, not exactly the fat of the land, but on the blood of their neighbours, and the blood of their friends, and the blood of our sons and your sons who have died out there. That is what the farmers are living on. Blood simply. However, generally farmers appeared to agree with the Allies and agree with Allied war aims. But when it came to supporting enlistment of their own sector, the recruiters were politely but firmly told no. The official recruiting body at this time was known as the Department of Recruiting in Ireland. And this body tried to overcome their reluctance on the part of farmers by trying to get local authorities, the local councils, to try and form farmers' sort of PALS battalions or PALS companies, where farmers could enlist together and fight together. The Department of Recruiting proposed each county council should raise 60 recruits to form these PALS companies. And to achieve this, each council member was asked to canvass in their local areas and try and secure 2 recruits each. However, the response from local authorities was swift and ultimately very predictable. The chairman of the county council, Thomas Duggan, the North Tipperary County Council, claimed that men on any of these recruiting committees that were set up would be looked upon by locals as spies and informers. Duggan also said, in any case, that even if these committees were set up, no men could be spared, and those engaged in agricultural work were of great importance anyway. He said, speaking for his own district, he would certainly state that if they were to carry out this recruiting program, forming these PALS companies, they could not produce any more food, and they had no men to spare anyway. He was of the opinion that the men who were engaged in producing food for a man were doing as useful work as the men engaged in producing munitions. His district was a tillage one, and his opinion was that no man could be spared from his locality. So this focus on farmer sons reflected the belief on the part of the British and the recruiting authorities that they were simply not doing enough. Farmers were threatened with conscription, which in turn only inflamed opinion and made people even more reluctant to enlist. Farmers felt enough recruits had gone already, and if the government wanted more tillage, which they did, then more men simply could not be spared. At the same time, though, there were also prejudices felt by the agricultural class towards the army. And this was acknowledged by the Department of Recruiting by the attempts to form these farmers' companies. Agriculture experienced a wartime boom, and the profits gained by staying at home, combined with the policy of protecting agricultural occupations, resulted in an unwillingness to enlist. Another point to note here is, particularly among the wealthier echelons of farmers, they regarded joining the army as a drop in status. The army was not a favoured occupation for farmer sons with prospects. So the main point here is that much damage had been done by these crude and unsympathetic recruiting methods, and the threatening positions taken by many recruiters left a lingering bitterness in the county throughout 1915. So who were these recruiters? Who were these people that were going around threatening crowds and calling for conscription? There was a general belief that somehow prominent individuals in any given area could persuade their neighbours to enlist. The conservative and sometimes inconsiderate selection of men who delivered speeches to nationalist audiences was responsible for a considerable feeling of ill will, disengagement and disenchantment with the war. Recruiting work attracted the establishment. So then, who were these recruiters? They could invariably be doctors, town clerks, persons in the Catholic clergy, town and county councillors, bank officials, bank managers, county and deputy lieutenants, government employees, resident magistrates, solicitors, mayors, county sheriffs, sub-sheriffs. So this list really underlines the formal and conservative nature of those advocating recruitment. Now, some of these speakers were not screened, and this gave rise to locally unpopular men on recruiting platforms. For example, in December 1915, the appearance and care of a disliked landlord was noted with distaste at Tipperary South Riding County Council. A councillor from Ballyporeen, William Fogarty, said, "The farmers of that district could not forget William Rochfort once boasted he could depopulate the county with one bottle of ink." He was in favour of a recruiting committee, if only for the purpose of keeping men like Mr. Rochfort off recruiting platforms. Fully half the members of every family in the parish of Burncourt have been driven to America by Rochfort, and it was a mockery to have a man like him talking to the people about recruiting. So this was something that was a continual problem for recruiting sergeants. Appeals from these unpopular speakers did not go down well with those they were trying to recruit. And in conjunction with this, the focus on conscription and on the hectoring attempts to enlist the sons of farmers alienated people. In our film, the Reverend Canon Sheehy felt the same way. He said, reading newspaper reports made at recruiting meetings throughout the county, they sometimes found in reality that they were anti-recruiting speeches, calculated to make the audiences antagonistic rather than sympathetic. The gentlemen who made such speeches did not understand the people or the circumstances of the county. So it was these conservative sons and daughters of the establishment who were the main recruiters. Senior Irish Parliamentary Party members also supported the war effort. In particular, the local MP that I mentioned before, John Cullen, was the main driver of this. While support from the Irish Party did melt away after the Rising, it was John Cullen who was recognised as one of the recruiting campaign's most vital supporters. A recruiting agent said in 1916, looking back on 1915, that John Cullen was the only man who was given any real help. So the establishment was to the fore, but most crucially, the lack of any representatives of the agricultural community reflected the attitude of farmers, or indeed the apathy of farmers. Recruiting work was effectively ignored by the very people they sought to enlist. But possibly the one institute that had considerable influence on nationalists and people in Tipperary at the time was the Roman Catholic Church. Now, the Church generally never made a formal statement on recruiting, nationally or locally. And basically the Church left it up to each individual priest to decide for themselves how they felt on the issue. The majority of the clergy in Tipperary, however, favoured the Allies. Many priests in the county supported the recruiting effort and spoke on recruiting platforms. For example, John Harty, Archbishop of Cashel and Emily, was a key driver of this, and he supported recruiting when the Home Rule Bill was put in the statute book in 1914. Harty was fairly unique. I mean, he was very supportive of the war effort, and he was one of only 9 bishops who continued to support the war into 1916. The bishop was not alone among the religious fraternity in supporting recruiting. The parish priest at Tipperary Town, Canon Arthur Ryan, Archdeacon Flavin, the parish priest at St. Peter and Paul's, and Father Edmund Kelly and army chaplain were all strongly in favour of the British war effort. Father Burke, a curate at Cork Jordan, told his congregation there, quote, "All had realised they had an Irish flag to defend with their lives. As long as every German atrocity was unavenged, and until the flag of freedom was flying over Europe, it was his conviction, and the conviction of every man and woman present, that the only field of labour for any man who was free and eligible was the battlefield." One priest in particular made a key contribution to the recruiting effort in Tipperary. That man was Canon Arthur Ryan. Army recruitment could only have been boosted in some way by Ryan's passionate appeals. A major influence on the priest were the connections between his family and the British Army, and it was the service of his nephews in particular during the European War, with the support for John Redmond, that led to Ryan becoming a major figure for recruiting in Tipperary. In July 1916, a professional soldier married to his niece was killed at the front. This concerned the family of his brother Charles, a doctor who lived near Canon Ryan in Tipperary town, and a stained glass window in the church there commemorates this British officer. Canon Ryan even managed a visit to the front, meeting with the commander of the 16th Irish Division, who was also a Tipperary man, Major General William Picking. He met with Father Edmund Kelly and many Irish soldiers there. He even apparently had a trench named after him, Canon's Trench. So Canon Ryan frequently appeared at recruiting meetings throughout 1915. But he became the target of those who resented his efforts. One occurrence in particular made the national papers. Before a recruiting meeting in October 1915, Ryan was mailed anonymous letters threatening personal violence if he took the chair at the recruiting meeting. A few days before, the people of the town were able to read posters denouncing the war effort and Canon Ryan's activities. Ryan dismissed these personally offensive threats, and the meeting went ahead with Ryan appearing on the platform with the rector of Tipperary. The Irish Times claimed Tipperary town was indignant when such threats were revealed, and the Freeman's Journal claimed Tipperary town had defended its priest. At the meeting, Ryan called the author of the recruiting posters against him a coward who deserved nothing but contempt. He said, "Were I to refuse to take this chair today, I should be false to my people, and false to my own past, and false to my own dead. From this platform I will call him a coward, a mean and contemptible coward, who, afraid to show his face, writes anonymous threats, and in the darkness of the night posts up his scurrilous placards." So Ryan was undeterred by these threats, and he called for more recruits to fill the vacant places in the Irish divisions. Ryan said it would be shameful if the ranks were filled by Scottish, English or Welsh recruits. He would enlist if he could, he said, and he had ancestors that fought with Sarsfield and the Irish Brigade. Enlisting, Canon Ryan claimed, would save them from everlasting self-reproach and their country from the extinction of her fame on the battlefield. On conscription, he said, there was only one way of bringing conscription, and that is by the men of the county failing to do their duty as voluntary recruits. So essentially for Ryan, this was about maintaining Irish divisions and avoiding conscription. This type of attempted intimidation against a priest was rare, however. The anti-recruiting forces were usually reluctant to attack priests, knowing that it could be counterproductive. But the total embracement of a recruiting campaign in the way that Canon Ryan did was rare, very rare. And opposition from clerics did exist in Tipperary. For example, Father Michael Maher wrote regularly in his diary of the impact of the war and of the support for the Allies, but he refused to speak on a recruiting platform. When a Lieutenant Colonel Charles Dalton from the Royal Army Medical Corps from Golden in Tipperary was killed, Father Matt Ryan of Knockavilla asked for prayers, but then he launched a stinging attack on local MPs in Tipperary who came around asking for recruits who, quote, wanted their sons to become maggots meat in France and Belgium. He was even more bitter regarding a recruiting meeting held in his parish a few weeks after this. He said at the meeting, or about the meeting, "I don't want to stop you if you want to go to France and eat turnips. You can stop a bullet, You can stop a bullet as well as any other and let John Bull stop at home. So these outbursts were reported to the police, who complained to the Archbishop Party, and in turn he promised to order Father Ryan not to offend again. So, generally, the clergy was in sympathy with the aims of the Allies. While the Church was officially neutral and never made an official comment on the question of recruiting, it was often left up to individual members to make up their own minds, and there is no doubt that there was a vibrant pro-recruiting stance taken in Tipperary by the Roman Catholic Church clergy, driven by Harty and Canon Ryan. How much this affected recruiting figures is very tempting. So, coming to the final part of motivations, we've seen how people in Tipperary were threatened with conscription. We've seen how recruiting work was done by members of the establishment and supported by the Roman Catholic clergy. So why then, in the midst of all this, would someone enlist in the army in 1915? Generally speaking, the motives of voluntary recruits to the army will always remain uncertain. The brutality of the war at the time was widely known. There is a misconception that people somehow didn't understand what was going on the Western Front in 1914 and 1915. That is false. The brutality of the war was widely reported. Casualties were widely reported. Many papers made predictions the war was going to be long. Even Kitchener's prediction the war was going to last 3 years was widely circulated in Tipperary papers. So there was a consensus it was going to be a long war, and brutality was widely reported. In Tipperary, this was even more so because the following year, in 1916, a hospital for wounded soldiers was established in Tipperary town. So you had about 1,000 to 2,000 injured troops back in the town, showing the effects of what happened on the front. So, therefore, any man who thought about fighting knew there was a very good chance he would be killed, disabled, or psychologically damaged. We can speculate on the reasons why a man may have joined the army in 1915. Money, adventure, peer pressure, military tradition in one's own family, travel, adventure. But what the First World War brought, I think, for the first time, was an idealistic dimension, particularly for Tipperary soldiers. Home rule, democracy, fight for small nations. And we've seen how Irish Party MPs in the county advocated this task. But the reasons for enlistment were complex, and of course we will never know for certain. Identifying a soldier's decision to enlist, or at least attempting to, is not a matter of scientific classification, but historical analysis and, yes, speculation. The typical recruit from Tipperary was generally an unskilled urban labourer. In 1911, unskilled labourers formed the second largest group of Irish workers, and unskilled men had traditionally supplied the bulk of recruits for the army. Despite some early optimistic predictions that a middle-class surge into the forces would transform the social composition of the army, the vast majority of servicemen came from the unskilled sector, urban, poorer classes. Now, with this in mind, much has been attributed to economics, money, as a motivation factor for joining the army. It is probably the most easily identifiable factor. The average weekly wage for an urban unskilled worker was 14 shillings a week. Basic pay for ordinary soldiers was £1 a day. But most soldiers got extra allowances, such as ones for shooting proficiency, and some could earn up to 3 shillings a day. On top of this wage, the pay and separation allowances available to those who enlisted were attractive to a potential recruit who had experience only of intermittent and low-paid employment or no work at all. In Tipperary, the living conditions of many urban people were very tough. This was not helped by sharp increases in food prices at the onset of the war, and worsened by poor wages, which did not keep up with inflation. In Rossgrave, a newspaper report at the time claimed the only way for many young men to make a living was to join the army. They joined because they wanted jobs, and this was the only way they were sure of getting money, as little as it was. Future IRA volunteer Seamus Babington wrote of the recruits in Carrick Most of them joined from sheer necessity, no industry, no employment. The money paid out through the separation allowance system increased in March, enhancing their appeal. This was if a soldier made an allocation from their pay, then the army would pay their wife and children a certain amount of money. A recruiting poster in the Nina Guardian in April 1915 advised Tipperary men to join at once, as your families will get good pay. Even senior military officers pointed to these separation allowances as the reason for enlistments. Colonel Cook, the general officer in command at the Royal Irish Regiment Depot in Clonmel, said, looking back at 1915, the joining of the army was purely a case of money and separation allowance. A magistrate said people living in certain areas of Tipperary town seemed to survive on separation allowances. However, there is little evidence to suggest the motivation to join the army was exclusively construed in terms of money, exclusively construed in economic terms. It's very, very difficult to find a soldier admitting he joined the army because he needed the cash. And the level of recruiting in Tipperary was of such a high extent that economics cannot explain comprehensively why so many men took a dangerous, uncomfortable, and arguably irrational decision to join the army. Whereas enlisting in peacetime could better the living conditions of an unemployed, poverty-stricken man, the risks and horrors of the European war made the trade-off very unfavourable. Other reasons for enlistment during this time were adventure, military tradition, and martial spirit. Would-be recruits during 1915 were offered the chance to join Irish regiments. Those enlisting in Tipperary could join the Royal Irish Regiment, one filled with local history and tradition, echoing past campaigns and victories in far-flung outposts of the Empire. Clonmel was the depot for the Royal Irish Regiment. It was called the Home Regiment by the Nationalists. And recruits could feel continuity with previous Tipperary men and consider themselves part of a long lineage of military tradition. The tradition of military service was very strong in Tipperary, and this was no doubt helped by the presence of so many garrisons, anchored by this depot at Clonmel. Now, this gave the army a high profile, with troop marches, parades, and even military funerals, representing a pomp and glamour that was attractive to the mundane drudgery of life in provincial towns. This was heightened in 1915 with the flurry of troop movements, mobilisation of local reservists, at which crowds gathered and cheered, where Irish volunteers provided guards of honour, and in some cases were inspected by British officers. A report from the Nina Guardian in early 1915, in April, illustrated how the British Army uniform had apparently turned from one of oppression into freedom in a matter of months. The report said, "Times have changed. Years ago, when the man donned the scarlet coat and took the Saxon shilling, he was considered a renegade and a traitor to his county. Today, the khaki coat of England is symbolic of patriotism and bravery. So recruits then do not become soldiers of the crown, but our lads in khaki." And this blurring of the line between Irish nationalism and British soldier would not have decreased the army's attractiveness. In a strange way, the many military funerals that were held through 1915 held a sort of morbid potency. For example, a sergeant from Barn, John O'Brien, died in late March. He left a widow and 4 children. He served 20 years in the army, and the funeral in Clonmel was full of powerful formality. 50 Royal Irish Regiment soldiers came from the barracks to form a guard of honour, while the coffin was removed from St. Peter and Paul's Church. It was covered with a Union Jack and placed on a 12-pounder gun carriage sent from the artillery that were based in Kerr. A firing party of 20 headed the cortege, and behind them became the 3rd Battalion Royal Irish Regiment Band. The Dead March was played, and the press at the time reported a huge turnout from the townspeople comprising all classes. When the remains were lowered into the grave, the firing party discharged 3 volleys, and the last post was played. So how do we know these funerals may have served to increase recruitment or increase the attractiveness of the army? One writer remembered these funerals he witnessed in Tipperary town as a child. He said, "We never missed a military funeral. They were wonderful affairs to us. The flag-covered coffin on the gun carriage, the band playing the Dead March with muffled drums. The most important part of the funeral for us was the firing of the volleys over the grave. Then, after the last post was sounded, all the soldiers in the band assembled on the road. They struck up a lively air and all marched back to the barracks. My father said the name of the tune was Another Man for the Shilling." So then, even in death, the military could give a gravitas to people who may have had little else. There was also a fraternal aspect at the time in joining the army. Many people had joined the Irish National Volunteers, and friends could join battalions with a strong local flavour and receive training at camps full of familiar faces. This was even more so the case in Tipperary, with the 49th Brigade of the 16th Irish Division based in the barracks in Tipperary town. This division was ultimately commanded, like I said, by a Tipperary man, William Hickey, from 1960. Family tradition was also important, and some with brothers, fathers, or uncles with military experience may have been more inclined to enlist. The pages of local newspapers are littered with examples of multiple enlistments from one family. Veterans with Crimean or Boer War experience were often followed into the military by their sons or nephews. For example, 2 sons of a Clonmel army pensioner were serving in the Royal Field Artillery. Nora Tobin of Catherine Street in Clonmel had 4 sons in the army. One died, one was gassed, and another suffered shell shock. George Maher of Nina had 5 sons in the army. One had been killed, while 18 families in Nina had 3 sons serving. For those belonging to militias, fraternities, or sporting clubs, the presence of so many of the Irish volunteers in the ranks showed there were those susceptible to collective pressure. 30% of the recruits who joined the army in Tipperary from 15th of December 1914 to 15th of December 1915 were Irish National Volunteers. 30. Adventure was also another motivation. It's hard to quantify, probably connected to the newfound vibrancy for all things military, coupled with a lack of opportunities at home. In Carrick, a report said it was only the very young, 17, 18 and 19 years that enlisted, then they enlisted for adventure, like all youth. Very few for the sake of helping England. The most convincing explanation of adventure as a motive for enlistment was that munitions work was better paid and safer than soldiering. Many men had a chance to go work for munitions in England towards the end of 1915. You see many ads appearing in local papers looking for people to come over and are paid very good wages. So, what was new about these motivations was idealism. And the continued flow of recruits throughout 1915 must be ascribed then to a combination of motives and loyalties. Recruiters made frequent reference, as we've seen, to German brutality and aggression, and also appealing to defence of one's country, small nations. The fate of Belgium was much commented on and reported in the press, but also, as we've seen, these lurid atrocities were. Redmond's pledge of support to England and encouragement of enlistment from the volunteers also played a role, as Tipperary MPs and Irish Party members made recruiting appeals based on idealism initially, which were then replaced by threats of conscription. The cause of the Allies was constantly referred to as a just one and a right one by local media. When 12 men left Jordan for the front in the summer of 1915, the local newspaper reported cheers were given again and again and again for the cause of right and justice. Enlisting as a way of showing gratitude for Britain putting Home Rule in the statute book, but then suspending it, was possible, but it's probable that idealistic motivations were usually taken with others. So, to conclude, the only way to really judge a recruiting campaign is by the amount who joined. So how many joined in Tipperary? Figures are very hard to pin down. It's very hard to get an exact figure because official figures for counties and depots were only kept until 1960. But from what I've been able to calculate so far, about 4,000 enlisted in Tipperary from 1914 to 1918. So 4,000 enlisted, and about 2/3 of the 4,000 enlisted in the first 16 months of the year. While the authorities felt, undoubtedly, that many more men in Tipperary could be spared, one British report said at least 6,000 more could have enlisted. 4,000 was still a massive contribution. Now, when we look back today at 1915, 1914, and we try and tease around possibilities of why someone would have joined the army, popular perception is that many people kind of waltzed off to oblivion during the war. We tend to see these men now as intoxicated, duped, fooled, or all three, into fighting for king and country by cynical governments with scant regard for the rights of small nations. But despite the threats, there was no conscription in Ireland during the war. The Irish were volunteers, in the sense they didn't have to go. They gave their lives willingly. Certain statistics show that recruiting actually increased in Tipperary well after the war, looked like anything like a picnic stroll to Berlin, which was early as September 1914, following the retreat from Ulm. The amount of recruits in the Royal Irish Regiment area actually increased from January to June 1915 on the previous 6 months. About 2,500 enlisted in the Clonmel Depot from August to January 1914 to 1915. About 2,900 enlisted in the next 6 months. So people knew what was going on in Europe. They were aware it was going to be a long war, but they still chose to enlist, and they chose to enlist in increasing numbers. The fact that enlistments continued to flow throughout 1915 frustrates the belief that men went off as dupes in the autumn of 1914 and 1915. Many factors influenced the decision to enlist, as we've seen. Maybe for one man, just one reason. Maybe for another, several. But what the First World War also brought to the table, for the first time for Tipperary recruits, was idealism. Much of them made of patriotism. And the other big words that surrounded it: freedom, rights, honour, self-determination, home rule. Military tradition, economics, martial spirit, and adventure also attracted men into the armed forces. The efforts at recruiting were haphazard. Irish Party MPs in Tipperary supported Redmond's call at Woodenbridge. They spoke at meetings advocating enlistment. But the authorities still felt, despite 4,000 enlisting, authorities felt the response had been very poor. This resulted in the use of atrocity reports, bitter criticism of farmers, and eventually people in Tipperary were threatened with conscription, something which even went against recruiters' own guidelines. The help of the senior Roman Catholic Church in Tipperary played a central role in the recruiting campaign, and this no doubt helped to offset some of the bungling and inept methods used by recruiters. Ultimately, the failure of the British authorities represented a failure to understand the political landscape in Tipperary. 4,000 was an impressive figure and materialised in spite of recruiting efforts rather than because of them. Thank you very much.